Hello and welcome back to Anthropology 201 World Cultures. This is Lecture Series 3, Part 2. And today we are going to cover family and marriage systems. Now, family and marriage both are terms that we are all very familiar with. But what do they really mean? When I say family, what words come to mind? What about when I say marriage? Well, most of us, when we try to define those, we'll all come up with different definitions than the next person. Well, and the truth of that is that in most cases, the terms for family and marriage and their meanings are ambiguous. This is because social scientists and the general public use these terms indiscriminately, which is fine. So, before we can understand the differences in marriage and family that we see in different cultures, we need a more formal definition for family and marriage. So first, family. A family is a social unit characterized by economic cooperation, the management of reproduction and child rearing, and common residence. I'll repeat it. A family is a social unit characterized by economic cooperation, the management of reproduction and child rearing, and common residence. Now, marriage is a socially approved union between two or more partners that regulates the sexual and the economic rights and obligations between them. One more time. Marriage is a socially approved union between two or more partners that regulates the sexual and economic rights and obligations between them. Now, what about the functions of family and marriage? Well, Malinowski and Radcliffe Brown, who were leaders of our functionalism theory, wanted to understand how the functions of family and marriage contributed to the individual and to the society. Well, one of the functions that they found was that it created stable relationships between men and women that regulate sexual mating and reproduction. Another function, particularly a function of marriage, is to provide a mechanism for regulating the sexual division of labor. All societies, in some way or another, be it biological or cultural, have divided labor somehow. Men do some tasks and women do other tasks. Now, the third function is that marriage creates family relationships that provide for 1. Material, 2. Educational, and 3. The emotional needs of children. Okay, moving on to another aspect of family and kinship, and that is mate selection. How do we, as humans, choose a mate, and how does our culture impact that? Well, simply put, our culture dictates who we can and cannot mate with. Now, all societies have established rules for mating. And since we just finished family structure, let's start with the most common rule, and that is the incest taboo. prohibition on mating with certain categories of relatives is known as the incest taboo. Now, incest taboos are different from rules that prohibit marrying certain kinsmen. But incest taboos and the rules of prohibition that say which kin you cannot marry often do coincide with each other, but not always, so do not assume. For the most universal form of incest taboo involves the mating between members of the nuclear family, so mothers, sons, fathers, daughters, brothers, and sisters. Now, although there are several notable exceptions that have popped up through history. In fact, royal families use incest in times of political, religious, or economic hardships. The royal families among the ancient Egyptians, the Incans, and Hawaiians were permitted to mate with and marry their siblings, although this practice did not extend to ordinary members of those societies. Now, the incest taboo invariably extends beyond the scope of the immediate family. In the U.S., for instance, people are forbidden by law in some states to mate with their first cousins. In other non-Western societies, the incest taboo can reach further into the extended family, and in some cases may only affect one side of the family and not the other. For example, a man is permitted, even encouraged, to mate with and marry the daughter of his mother's brother. This would be a first cousin or a crossed cousin, but is strictly forbidden from doing so with the daughter of his mother's sister, which is also a first cousin, but a parallel cousin. Now, anthropologists find the incest taboo in some form in every culture. Because of this, anthropologists have long since been interested in explaining the origins and persistence of it. Now, all societies define some set of kin that is off limits for marriage and sexual intimacy. But the rules for mating go far beyond don't mate with your brothers and sisters. Every society have restrictions on their choice of marriage partners. Some are laxer than others, but the rules exist. And in every culture, people are dissuaded away from one group and strongly encouraged towards another group. These are known as the rules of exogamy and the rules of endogamy. Exogamy means marrying outside a certain group. Endogamy, marrying within a certain group. So first, the rules of exogamy. Since the incest taboo is so universal, all societies have rules about marrying outside a certain kin group. These rules are known as the rules of exogamy. Now, the rules of exogamy vary culture to culture and are not always dependent on the closeness of blood ties, like the closeness of brother to sister or sister to second cousin. For example, here in the U.S., our rules of exogamy extend only slightly beyond the nuclear family. It is ill-advised or illegal in some states to marry and mate with one's first and second cousins. However, aside from that, anyone else is fair game. So you may encounter mild disapproval for marrying any relative, no matter how distant they may be. Now, in other societies that may be based on unilineal descent, the exogamous group is usually the lineage. This can include hundreds of people, or it can include the clan, which would be thousands of people. Next, the rules of endogamy. Now, in contrast to exogamy, we have the rules for endogamy, which is marrying within a certain group. We see rules of endogamy in the Incas of Peru and in the Republic of South Africa for much of the 20th century. Now, even though there are no laws or rules of endogamy here in the US, it is still seen in some ways. People often marry within their own group based on class, ethnicity, religion, and race. Now, the general social segregation by class, combined with the parental and peer pressure to quote-unquote marry your own kind, has resulted in a high level of endogamy in complex Western societies. Now, arranged marriages. In Western society, there is typically a strong emphasis on individualism, and mate selection is largely a decision made jointly by both members of the relationship. Among satisfying the emotional and sexual needs of the individual, the choice of mates in Western society is based on factors such as physical attractiveness, emotional capability, or rather emotional compatibility, as well as capable matters of emotion, and romantic love. Now, these factors are still influenced by the culture. Even though most Westerners have the freedom of choice, social class, ethnicity, and religion still plays a part in selecting a mate. However, in some societies, the interests of the families are so strong that marriages are arranged. The family members of both members of the relationship negotiate and decide who will marry whom. In certain cultures, such as traditional Japan, India, and China, the arrangements often take place while the two individuals are children. All such cases of arranged marriage, wherever they may be found, are based on the cultural assumption that because marriage is a union of two kin groups, rather than merely two individuals, it is far too significant an institution to be based on something as trivial as physical attractiveness or romantic love. Now, arranged marriages are often found in societies that have elaborate social hierarchies. A good example is Hindu India. Indian arranged marriages are further reinforced by other traditional Indian values and beliefs. It was generally believed that fathers sinned if they failed to marry off their daughters before puberty. Now, the reason for this is that traditionally, Hindu society viewed females as lustful beings, and would often tempt males with their sexual favors. So a girl had to be married at an early age to protect herself and the reputation of her family. Now, we talked about arranged marriage, so there are two more types I want to cover, and that is, one, the preferential cousin marriages, and two, the levirate and sororate marriages. Now, in each of these relates to arranged marriages in the sense that it is a cultural expectation. So, a common form of preferential marriage is preferential cousin marriage, which is practiced in some form in most major regions of the world. Some kinship systems distinguish between cousins, such as parallel and cross, and others do not. In societies that a distinction between parallel cousins who are considered family members and are called brother and sister. So they are excluded as potential marriage partners. Cross cousins, however, are not thought of as family members, but are considered by some societies as a preferred marriage partner. Now, this is because such a union would maintain the ties between kin groups established by the marriages that took place in the preceding generations. Next is the levy rate and the sororate marriages. Now, individual choice also tends to be limited by another form of mate selection that requires a person to marry the husband or wife of deceased kin. The levy rate is the custom whereby a widow is expected to marry the brother or some close male relative of her dead husband. Now, what about the kids that they have after this new union? Would they be considered part of the brother's family, or are they part of the dead husband's family? Usually, any children fathered by the woman's new husband are considered to belong legally to the dead brother rather than to the actual father. Now, the levy rate is practiced in a wide variety of societies. It's practiced in Oceania, Asia, Africa, and India. So, what does this practice serve for the widow? What does it serve for the widow's children? What about the dead husband's lineage? Well, this custom serves as a form of social security for the widow and her children, and it preserves the rights of the husband's family to her future children. Also, this custom is closely associated with placing a high value on having male heirs so that the man's lineage will not die out. So, the sororate is the male equivalent of the levy rate. So the sororate is the practice of a widower marrying the sister or some close female relative of the deceased wife. Okay, so moving on. In the same way that societies have rules for whom you can marry, there are also rules for the number of spouses you can have. So, cultural anthropologists have identified 3 major types of marriages based on the number of spouses allowed. The first one is monogamy. Monogamy is the practice of having only one spouse at a time. The next one is polygyny. And polygyny is the practice of having more than one wife at a time. The third major type is polyandry. Polyandry is the practice of having more than one husband at a time. Now, first, monogamy, the practice of only having one spouse at a time. So, for us Americans and Canadians for that matter, the concept of monogamy is so ingrained in our culture and lives that it is often very difficult for us to imagine sharing a spouse. In fact, any person who does take more than one marriage partner at a time is in violation of conventional norms, most of our religious standards, and the law in most cases. Now, even though the thought of sharing a spouse is hard for us to understand, and even harder for us to practice, we as Westerners have found ways to circumvent the notion of lifelong partnerships. We accept the ideas of adulterous affairs, provided that they are discreet. We also practice serial monogamy. Now, serial monogamy is the practice of taking a number of different spouses, one after another, rather than at the same time, which is quite common here in the US as well as Canada and much of Western Europe. Next is polygyny. Now, polygyny, the practice of having more than one wife at a time, is practiced widely in traditional India and China and remains a preferred form of marriage throughout Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Many cultures that practice polygyny today are small-scale societies with small populations. In most cases, polygyny in these societies is the ideal form of marriage, but not the usual form of marriage. There are many reasons for this. First, any marriage requires the approval and financial support of kinsmen. Second, in some polygynous societies, it is considered inappropriate for men of low rank to seek additional wives. And third, the management of 2 or more wives and their children within a household requires great administrative skills. In fact, some African society, the word for co-wife is derived from the root word for jealousy. Now, next is polyandry. Polyandry is the practice of having more than one husband at a time. This practice is incredibly rare. In fact, only 1% of societies in the world practice polyandry. The most notable societies are in Tibet, Nepal, and India. Now, polyandry may be fraternal or non-fraternal, meaning the husbands could be brothers. The best known case of polyandry was found among the Toda of southern India. They practiced the fraternal polyandry. Traditionally, when a woman married a man, she also became the wife of all of his brothers, including those who had not yet been born. Now, marriage privileges rotated among the brothers, and they all lived in a single household. Despite this fact, there was actual little competition or sexual jealousy. Now, when the wife got pregnant, the paternity was not necessarily given to the biological father or genitor. Instead, there would be a ceremony that established a social father, or pater. And this was typically the oldest brother. Alright, so we talked about number of spouses, the types of marriages, and who is considered an acceptable partner, and who is not. So now, we're going to look at the economics of marriage. So, for the most of the societies, a marriage is viewed as a binding contract between, at the very least, 2 individuals, but could extend to 2 kinship groups. It also represents the legal rights to children, and it represents the legal rights to each other's economic goods and services. It is often the transfer or rights that are accompanied by the transfer of some type of economic consideration. Now, these transactions can take place before or after the marriage and fall into 3 different categories. There is bride wealth, bride service, and dowry. So first is bride wealth. Bride wealth is the compensation given upon marriage by the family of the groom to the family of the bride. Bride wealth is practiced worldwide but is most prominent in Africa. Bride wealth is paid in a wide variety of currencies, but in almost all cases, the commodity used for payment is highly valued in the society. For example, the Chukchi use reindeer, the Navajo use sheep, the Nuer used cattle. But it wasn't just livestock that is used as bride wealth. The Kwakiutl used blankets, and the Fiji used mats. Now, the higher the bride wealth, the greater the chance the couple will stay together because of family pressure. Large bride wealth payments tend to make negotiations more flexible and consequently more cordial. But when bride wealth payments are low, the negotiation becomes highly critical and is likely to create hard feelings. This is because the addition and subtraction of one item is much more considerable than it is with the higher bride wealth payments. Now, cultural anthropologists consider bride wealth a rational and comprehensible part of traditional systems of marriage. Bride wealth is seen as a security or insurance for the good treatment of the wife, and it was a mechanism to stabilize marriage by reducing the possibility of divorce. Okay, next is bride service. So, in societies that have considerable material wealth, we see the practice of bride wealth. But, because people in small-scale societies, the accumulation of capital goods is much more difficult. So men often give their labor to the bride's family instead of material goods. This is bride service. Now, bride service can be done to the extent that material property is completely excluded in the transaction, or it can be done with the expectation that material property will be given at a later date. Typically, when a man marries under a system of bride service, he often moves in with his bride's family. He will then work or hunt for them. And this service is a probationary period that can last several weeks to several years. Bride services are likely to be found in nomadic foraging societies, such as the Juhansi. Now, according to work done by Janice Stockard in 2002, the Juhansi fathers pick husbands for their daughters based on hunting skill. The men must demonstrate considerable hunting expertise before they are eligible to marry. This is because the daughter's husband will provide him meat through a prolonged period of bride service. The final marriage transaction is the dowry. Like bride wealth, it is an exchange of goods or money, but this goes in the other direction. A dowry is an exchange of goods or money transferred from the bride's family to the groom or groom's family. The dowry is always paid by the bride or the bride's family, but the recipient varies from culture to culture. In some cases, the dowry was given to the groom, and he could do with it as he saw fit. However, in other cases, such as rural Ireland, the dowry was given to the groom's father. This This was done in a sort of compensation for the land that the groom's father would bequeath to the bride and groom. And the dowry was often used wholly or in part to pay the dowry for his daughter. Now, the dowry is only found in Eurasia, and is most notably in medieval and Renaissance Europe and northern India. Now, the dowry is usually not given to the groom, but is rather something that the wife brings with her into the marriage. For example, in traditional society in Cyprus, the dowry was often a house or other valuable property. And if the husband mistreated the wife, or the marriage ended in divorce, the woman was entitled to take the dowry with her. So the dowry, much like the bride wealth, was a device used to stabilize marriage by providing a strong economic incentive to not break up. Okay, so this has been Lecture Series 3, Part 2. Next time, we are going to be looking at our horticulturalist cultures, the Azande, the Hmong, and the Yanomamo.